Awesome. So I'm here with my guest today, John McDowell. Obviously, I've been trying to get you on for a little while. So,
Yep.
and one of the things, that I guess, well, originally my introduction to you was my son Isaac, because he wanted to do jujitsu, and then he
Yeah.
was like telling me, "This guy's amazing, really great guy, very positive, and everything else."
Oh,
I think he even burned me a little bit in that conversation because he's like,
man.
"Dad, I think he's your age and he looks like better."
What? Oh,
So
man. That's what's up.
yeah, so so he was telling me about you, and then obviously I joined your classes for a duration and everything else, and got to know you, and then following you on social media, and extremely positive individual. You're someone
Trying
that's
to.
always driving to self improve, um, and yeah, you're just always family oriented. I guess comes to mind when I think of you, and later on, I don't even remember how it came up to be, but maybe we talked or maybe messaging back and forth, knowing a little bit of your story. And I thought to myself, like, that's, just remarkable, I guess, like the person you are today. And I'm sure that
Thank
shaped
you.
you in some way. So, um,
You know what? I was thinking back to some of the conversations I tend to have at the end of jujitsu class, right? That last 5-10 minutes.
mhm.
And we just have such a wide array of people with so many different types of backgrounds.
Yeah.
You've got people that are law enforcement, right? Fire department, nurses, doctors. At the same time, you got folks that are coming out of addiction, right? Or on probation, stuff like that. So you just have such a wide array of people. And I think there was one of those nights where I shared kind of where I came from and why it was significant for me, right? To get out there and teach and give back and help other folks not go down that same path.
Yeah.
And then you had pulled me aside and were like, "Man, thank you very much for sharing, blah blah blah." And I don't know. And then later on, you were like, "Hey, we should do this podcast."
Yeah.
I was like, "What the heck?"
Yeah.
Okay, man. So and you were persistent,
Yeah.
and finally got me here.
I
So
did. Yeah. I'm a huge fan. By the way, I'm a huge fan of you, and yeah, everything. I love following you. And um,
it's
so,
reciprocated,
yeah,
right?
thank you. I
So
appreciate it. So, people that may not, would it be considered a dojo? Is that kind of like a
we
jujitsu?
just call it a martial arts academy.
Okay, so
The
you're
old
owner
school
of,
dojo
yeah,
sounds cool too,
yeah,
but yeah.
yeah, owner of Martial Arts Academy. You work at St. Francis,
hmm
and what's kind of your job title there, and what do you do there?
Chief Information Officer.
Chief Information Officer, and then
So in simple terms,
yeah,
I would be the guy responsible for leading the technology
yeah,
department. Yeah.
and you're still going to school too,
Correct.
right?
Yeah, in the midst of my doctorates right now.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Thank you.
So I guess when I think of all that stuff, I mean, it's very clear that you're a very driven individual. Like, I got to think like some of it started back in the past and circumstances. Like, tell me a little bit about your upbringing and how you got to where you're at now.
Okay. So I grew up in a broken home. I grew up here in Salina. Absolutely love Salina. Um, just everything about Salina. I love Salina. And my mom, my dad, if I were to try to imagine how they even met and what would have connected them to one another, I have no idea. But somehow, right, I ended up coming to be, and they ended up splitting. They got married, and I think they were married for like 8 months, right? And so he ended up going and getting married. I got some brothers with my dad and his wife, and then I ended up being raised by my mom and my stepdad, and have a couple brothers and sisters on that side. And so um, really spent every other weekend with my dad, right? And my dad was just this solid, good dude. You know what I mean? Everything and anything I think of just being a productive member of society, I think of my dad, um, which was so opposite of my upbringing at my mom and my stepdad's, right? And so there were just a lot of drugs, a lot of people coming in and out, prostitution type stuff, and that was just normal. So really what was normal there, when I would go over to my dad's and stay the weekend and see their family, right? I think about the Friday night, family sitcoms that were on, and they're sitting down and they're watching TV shows together. That is not the experience I was getting throughout the week. You know what I mean? And it it's interesting how your environment helps shape how you perceive things, because when I would look at my dad and my brothers and their lifestyle, it was so foreign to me. It actually seemed like the environment I was being raised in was normal. And all of these good things that they had going on, I realized later, that's what it should have looked like, right?
Yeah.
But to me at that point in time in my life, it was abnormal. And so really I always just look at the way I grew up tailored me towards eventually ending up in juvenile detention. At one point in time, I was
What age were you at that time, John?
I was 14 the first time I got arrested, and in fact, one of the reasons, right? I can't say it was the only reason that I went to work at St. Francis. One of the reasons was Bill Clark. He's just a tremendous leader. He has just had such a positive impact on my life. But he ended up becoming the CEO of St. Francis. And at 14, that first time I got locked up, I ended up going out and being a child in need of care. So I was actually one of St. Francis's kids. I spent time out at Salina West, right? And so I got to see how those people work, what they do. When they talk about, having to deal with high acuity kids, or just those kids that had knives and guns and all this other stuff on them, and they're trying to help them positively impact them and change their life. I was one of those kids that they impacted, right? And so for me, working there, it means more than just going there and showing up. You know what I mean? I'm trying to do everything I can to help those people shape those young lives. And so 14, I ended up out at St. Francis. And at that time, I was taken out of my mom's home. They put me in my dad's home, and man, did they try to offer me some grace. And I definitely, I don't have the same level of grace and patience that my dad does, but he had a tremendous amount when it came to me. And so he did. He welcomed me. I lived there for a little bit, eventually got in trouble again, and at that point they took me out of both homes, and then I was fully in DCF custody, and I ended up going to Forbes. Forbes was like a juvenile detention center. However, I think the difference there was you had some of those kids were like 19, right? So going in, I'm 14. I'm trying to think. I remember going in my freshman year, I was 4'11". I tried to bribe the gal doing the physical to just write 5 foot. You know what I mean? I give you $20, she wouldn't do it. So I walked in my freshman year at 4'11" and maybe like 80 some odd pounds. So I was just a small dude.
Yeah.
And walking into a juvenile detention center that small, right? I fought a lot. That was a normal part of life for me. And it just escalated from there, right? I spent time in different juvenile prisons. I spent time in and out of lockup for about a decade. Eventually, I made my way to the penitentiary, right? I ended up going on the run at 18, and December 25th, went to my mom's to open some presents. My ex-wife, she was pregnant with Tristan, my oldest. And they showed up at like 10:30, and at that point I was ready to go. I'd been on the run. That was the first time I'd been out of Kansas, was when I was on the run. I went to Texas for a bit, got to see Mexico, went to Colorado, worked as a painter under the table.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, right, my horizons broadened somewhat. It just wasn't Salina, you know what I mean? And I'm seeing all these other things. I'm like, wow. And then Tristan, that was probably changed my entire perspective on the world. That's how powerful it was to be thinking I could be a dad. And I knew at that point, being on the run, that all of the mistakes I'd made up to that point, I couldn't take back. So that desire to be a dad and offer him a different lifestyle, the only thing I could do at that point was try to change myself so that when I got the opportunity to be the dad that I wanted to be, I could, right? And so his mom was pregnant, sorry, December 25th, 2000. I go to prison. I get locked up. I spend some time in the county. Tristan was born 2 weeks before I get sent off. And then I didn't get to see him for another 6 months. Time was rough. It really was. Again, right? If I was small going into that, to Forbes at 14, I was 19 when I went into the penitentiary. I was the smallest guy there. And again, fighting was just normal for me. All that time in my teenage years, I did the best I could to be the best criminal I could possibly be. Is that me? That is me. Sorry.
You're good.
And so tried to be the best criminal, the best gangbanger, the best anything and everything I could when it came to being a criminal, right? And so when I ended up getting to prison and I was still fighting all the time, there was still this piece of me that was trying to figure out how in the world I was going to use this time to help right my own personal ship so that I could be the person I wanted to be when I got out and I was able to be a dad. And so it was very interesting, man. My time hadn't all showed up yet because it was running concurrently. And so there were a couple different cases and for fighting. And one of the cases had come through, so it made it look like I only had a couple years that I had to serve, when all reality I was sentenced to 75 months.
Oh, wow.
And so I go, and the first piece was getting my GED. And mind you, I had dropped out, man, really my sophomore year, and really wasn't paying attention my freshman year, right? So I was just all over the place. So from my vantage point, and just how people speak to you back then, right? Growing up in that household, it's not like people were saying, hey, you're smart, you're intelligent, you can do all of these things, right? That was not that was just not what was being spoken to me, right? So I kind of had this own perception of myself that I just wasn't the smartest guy on the, and I could be crafty just because I, was in the streets a lot, stuff like that. But when it came to education, it just wasn't my thing. So it's funny to sit here and talk about me going for my doctorates right now because it really stems back to that first year in prison and going for my GED. My scores were high enough, and the gal that got my results back without me knowing took those results and sent them to several colleges. And so when I showed up for her to give me my results and just sit down and kind of tell you this, that, or the other, what the next steps are, she also showed me 5 other envelopes. And in those 5 envelopes were scholarships to different colleges.
Oh, how cool is that?
So she had went. It was a moment that had, even to this day, it shaped my future. That's how powerful that one moment was. She didn't know. She had went and did some background checking, right? All of my cases hadn't showed up. So it looked like I was going to get out in 24 months. And so she's thinking, man, we can get this worked out. This can change your life. You can go to college, da-da-da-da. And I had to tell her, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. This is a game changer for me. However, the rest of my time hasn't showed up yet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I really have 5 years left. And but there was the shift, right? And all of a sudden it was like, okay, maybe I'm not the fool that I think I am, right? Maybe I did pick up some stuff. I've just not ever applied myself. And then so I started looking and digging into some of what the other prisons offered. I was at Norton Prison at this point, and they had an IFI program, Interchange Freedom Initiative. And it was a Christian program. It was almost like going to a seminary, right? And they were moving from the minimum security to a medium security. And I wasn't able to get minimum custody because of the violent crimes and stuff. And so they have this scale from 1 to 10. And based on where you set is whether or not you can get to minimum. And so if not, you have to be good enough to get minimum by exception, where your counselor says, you know what, this guy has shown he's not this level of violent, right? And
Yeah.
they let you go to a minimum custody. And so I wasn't able to achieve that. But when IFI moved to Ellsworth, I was then able to go transfer and go. And there was my opportunity. It was a game changer because they had a computer program there going on. There was a gentleman who saw a young kid, hot-headed, right, but who liked computers. I really had not even touched a computer up to that point. But there were computer parts everywhere, and I was able to just go into that class and just start taking stuff apart. And I was just, whoa, this is awesome. And he came by, he dropped some books, and he said, hey, man, if you really enjoy this, here's some books. Check them out. If you have some questions, come ask me. That guy had a master's degree in computer science. He was extremely intelligent. Oh, my gosh, when it came to computers. And he's successful today. I don't want to name any names, but he is successful, runs his own business, still doing computer stuff. He's in the midst of his doctorates. And so just extremely grateful for that individual. But he opened the door for me to be exposed to that. And it was like 6 months later that he asked me if I wanted to go start teaching some of the courses. We had several lifers, right? And in prison, it's good and bad, but hope is a powerful thing, right? And so these guys who are doing life, the idea of going and taking a course and learning about things like that, which were new at that time to them, offered them hope upon getting out and being able to then ease themselves back into society. And so it was awesome. That experience working with those lifers, I got the opportunity to teach those classes. I remember being pulled in by the director of IFI, and he told me that I don't deserve that position. He thinks I'm just a young gangbanger, and there are so many other people that rightly deserve the opportunity to be teaching in there. And so that was like, he's like, oh, what do you say? He said, I know you're a leader, but you've been leading people down the wrong path your entire life. And that stuck with me. And I was like, all right, man, I'm going to prove this dude wrong, right? And I got pulled in 6 months later, and he shook my hand, thanked me. And I reiterated what he said to me. And I said, what I learned from that experience outside of you tell me I can't do something was that I'm on a different path. You're right. Mm-hmm. I was leading people down the wrong path. I've always been a leader, and now I have an opportunity to lead them down the right path. And so that changed the game for me, man. I ended up getting my bachelor's degree in psychology while I was in there. I went through that entire program. I think we started out with like 48 guys in group 6, and I think we graduated with like 12. So, I mean, it was a very rigorous process, right? And yeah, man, I got so many off the wall. I still ended up fighting at different points in time, right? Still had all these off the wall crazy experiences while in there, but the game changed for me inside of there. I can't speak for everybody. I know that I've got many friends that didn't have the same experience at all, right? And so it's hard for me to sit there and not see my time in prison as being one of the best things to have happened to me, because it truly helped shape who I am today. And
well, I think that's always interesting, like, I guess, about you. Like, there's just different types of people, but, like, some people, it's like something terrible happens and they kind of stew in it, and you've always been someone that's, like, still to this day, you're like, something happens and you're like, okay, like, how am I going to make this better? Like, you're learning from it, you know what I mean? And it's
absolutely
clear from your, just like from following you and other things, you're like a guy that's always learning. And and there was evidently a mental shift there for you where you're like, okay, like I'm not dumb, I'm intelligent, and I'm going to learn from this, and I'm going to create something out of it. So then, were you did you start jujitsu younger then, or when did you start kind of like that journey?
No, so I after I got so going back just a little bit before jiu-jitsu, I ended up spending my last year and a half at Wichita Work Release, which is right across from the new arena downtown. I say new; it's been a couple years old now.
Yeah.
But they're in Wichita, right there in the heart of Wichita downtown.
Okay.
Catty corner to that is the Wichita Work Release. And I spent 6 months working inside that facility. The last year, though, they give you the ability to go and find a job out in society, right? And then you just spend your nights back there. That's how I ended up meeting my wife. She was working at the Hyatt in HR. And one of my buddies had come back and said, listen, man, there's this really hot, tall chick. Just fill in an application just so you can go down there and meet her. Like, she is legit. I was like, man, that's what's up, right? Like, good looking out. And so I go down there, and the counselor is supposed to call before you go down there, and basically the conversation goes like this. Hey, John McDowell is coming down. He filled an application. He wants to come interview. However, he's a violent criminal, and so, we just want to make sure you're aware. So I show up looking somewhat like this, right? But younger, right? And so, and I just remember because she killed the whole violent criminal piece all in like a single statement. Walked in, I'm like, hi, I'm John McDowell. And she just looked at me, chuckled a little bit, and she said, you're John McDowell, the violent offender. And so she just had this image, right, that I was going to come in all tatted up, you know what I mean, and head shaved, and just whatever her perception of people who are violent criminals in prison, right? And so that was it. We ended up dating 2 years, or 2 months later, sorry. And, and now we have 2 beautiful children and got grandkids, and it's awesome. But I would be amiss if I didn't share that piece of the story because it, again, helped shape. When I got out, I stayed in Wichita for about 6 months. I got the opportunity to have Tristan every other weekend as much as I possibly could, but eventually his mom ended up having some issues with substance abuse, right? And so it was my opportunity to go get custody of Tristan, so I went and did that. So I moved back to Salina, went and I want to say I worked at Tony's Pizza for like 3 hours, and then called Jen and said, I can't do this. I got to do something else. If I do this, I'm not going to have enough time to invest in some of these other areas, right? And man, I just felt like I'd spent all that time in prison trying to educate myself, get myself to a different place, right? I just couldn't, I really felt at that point like it was just not a good fit, you know what I mean? And I was going to be too tired. I was getting up early. They were like 12-hour shifts. And so I called up a friend of mine he worked at Brian's Paint Shop, who that dude is awesome guy, right? Takes in a guy like me. I'm making maybe $725, $750 an hour. However, it got me out of there early enough that I could spend time with my family, and then I could invest in technology, right? And so we had $100, and this was one of those kind of forks in the road for McDowell. We weren't making a lot of money. I think my dad and stepmom came and dropped off some food for me, Jen, and Tristan, right? I mean, it was Struggle Street, and making $7.50 an hour was not a lot back then, right? And so, and then Jen was working for Salina Regional Health Center in HR, right? Which was great, but we were struggling. And so I went to her and I said, listen, I think that I can go work in the IT field. Like, I really think I can do this and help people. And for her, you know what I mean? Like I definitely keep my wife on her toes, for sure. And I would say between the two of us, I'm the one with the entrepreneurial spirit. You know what I mean? And so she's much more conservative on that front. So for me to just turn and say, I think I can make it in the IT field while I'm sweeping floors at Brian's paint shop is just a different, you know what I mean? Just a different thought process. And so she said, we have $100 and that's it. And she wasn't going to give me the $100 at first. And so I explained to her there was A+ certification book at the bookstore at the mall. And there was a guy at that point selling 2 boxes of used computer parts in the buyer's guide. And I explained that to her, and she said, well, how do you know that you're going to be successful, blah, 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 blah. I was like, I don't. I said, but if I'm being honest with what I know versus being afraid of what may or may not happen, what I do know is I can take the $100, go buy some dope, cut it, and get started and make some extra money and go from there and start making sure that we've got extra money in our pockets, which will send me back to prison.
Yeah.
Or I can take that $100 and I just explained to you what we can do with it. And what I can promise you is I will spend the next 6 months doing anything and everything I can to educate myself so that I can go be successful in the IT field. And it was amazing. All of these things came together. I mean, I literally went and got all that stuff from a really sketchy area of town, right? But I ended up with those 2 boxes of computer parts, and I went page by page by page to that A+ certification book. I spent the next 6 months. I'd go to Brian's paint shop. I would sweep floors. I'd go home. I'd spend a few hours. 9 o'clock would roll around. I'm out in the garage. Didn't matter what temperature. I'm out there working on computers and going through that book. 6 months later, I end up going and taking the A+ certification exam. I get certified. While we were looking for a place to get married, one of the pastors, his brother-in-law was running a consulting business, and he was looking for somebody. And so we ended up not going with that pastor's church, but he was like, you know what? My brother-in-law is looking for somebody. You mentioned that your husband just got certified. Maybe we should get them together and have a conversation. And so rather than a conversation, it immediately turned into an interview.
That's awesome.
It was a 4-hour interview. Thank you, Brian. But, that was it. He helped set in motion, and he, once again, is another leader that offered me a tremendous amount of grace. If you can just imagine having gone through lockup and different juvenile prisons, adult prison, and stuff like that, my ability to communicate, articulate, carry myself as normal folks do was just not all there. You know what I mean? It took me a long time to transition, and he challenged me every bit of the way. You think that this is right. Are you sure? Well, that's just the way it's always been. That's why we're having this conversation. That's why I'm asking the question. Are you sure that this is the way to do it? Dude, why do you always see it so different? You know what I mean? And so he just challenged me. He challenged me in my faith. He challenged me in my life. And to this day, right? So I'll be in IT for 17 years in June. And I still refer back to things that I learned from that man. And I only got to work for him for a couple of years. And we've been friends ever since. So that set the stage, man. I spent 2 years consulting. And grateful for Brian's paint shop, grateful for the Hyatt for hiring me while I was locked up, grateful for coming across my wife in just some opportune moment, you know what I mean? And getting an opportunity to invest in my oldest and get time back to invest in him, right, that I missed while being in prison. Getting the opportunity in prison to get a degree, to be exposed to a Christian program like IFI, to be exposed to technology, and just so happens that they have a guy in there with a flippin' master's degree in computer science, right? Who saw a young man who just needed some direction, you know. Just so many opportunities to be around people who didn't see me where I was at that moment, but they saw who I could become. You know what I mean? And it's just, it's those types of people are the people that I've tried to keep around in my life, and for whatever reason, keep attracting those types of people, and I'm grateful for them. So.
That's awesome. You and then also like as a, I guess the entrepreneur side, like who was I talking to the other day? There's a gentleman, Pate. He just started with you, and I was I was talking to him about it. And jiu-jitsu, he's like, "Well, I think I'm gonna go check this out." And I'm like, "Dude, they're an amazing group of guys. I keep thinking about getting back into it." I'm like, "They're awesome. You're gonna love it." And so and he ended up going. And last I talked to him, he loves it. But he said. I think he told me like you've got like 40 some people now, or like I don't know.
Dude,
It was
it's
like
grown. So again, and I guess I completely went off and didn't answer your original question. When did you get into jiu-jitsu, right? So I got into jiu-jitsu about 6 months after moving back to Salina, and it started with MMA, and so wouldn't it have saved me some time if I would have known about MMA once upon a time and there was a legal way
to fight?
Yeah, you know what I mean? It just, the thought always occurs to me like, dude, why did nobody just say, man, you're already doing this. Why don't you do it this way? And you don't have to get locked up. You know what I mean? So I go through that, and a couple of the gyms in town closed, but those guys I was training with, I had already been studying jiu-jitsu for a while. I was just doing it off of YouTube and stuff like that. And when that last gym closed, all of those guys started coming and training in my basement, in my backyard. And so it didn't matter if it was, 10 degrees or if it was 100 and some odd degrees, we were training. And eventually, all the grace that Jen offered us for letting us use the basement in the backyard, eventually that wore thin, and she said, dude, you got to do something. You know what I mean? And so these guys, you have gym people at the house 24/7. You know what I mean? And yeah, so we ended up there for a while. We were dragging mats out to soccer fields, right? Out south, baseball fields, wherever we could just put mats down. That's how we were training. And then eventually, John Hollis was training around that time. And I think he had went and met with Tony Dong and some of those guys, right? And at that point, I think that they had an MMA thing going, right, where they were sponsoring fights and stuff like that, that promotion. And they, I think, fronted Hollis some money to help us get a gym, and we were just training in this makeshift garage, right, for a long time. And eventually I had an opportunity to go work with Ernest Lazo, who had a martial arts karate gym here in town. And we went over there, and it began to grow from there. And then again, got an opportunity. He was going to end up closing his doors, and Scott Tolley, who runs Driven, right, had some space. And so we were using that area, and things continued to grow. And then Driven moved out, and Jake Sharp, Sharp Performance, bought that facility. And we've now been with Sharp for several years, and it's just continued to grow. I think we've got like 10 kids, and yeah, like 35, 40 adults. I mean, it's wild to see it grow like it has. At the same time, at one point, I want to say 14 years ago, I was contemplating whether or not I was going to go be a pastor. And so I was going through all of those, everything you had to do that at church taking all of the classes. At the same time, the door was opening to start the gym. And that week, for whatever reason, I was taking phone calls from folks, right? They were just struggling in life. Their marriage was having problems. Their kids doing this, that, or the other, right? They just needed somebody to talk to. There were folks talking about suicide, or drinking, drugs, all these different things. And then I would show up, right? We open the doors, and I have these people sitting there, and they're listening to me as I'm showing them these moves, and the thought occurred to me that, yes, I could go be a pastor, but those people that show up traditionally are already Christians, predominantly the people you have there, right? Mm-hmm. Unless you just have these strays that kind of make their way in, majority of those folks are there because they're Christians and they want to be. The people I had on the mats were from every walk of life, right? And from my vantage point, whether they're Christians or not, it was an opportunity to invest in those folks and give them a different opportunity or sense of direction for their future, right? And so it's always been kind of how you can take the application of what you're learning on the mats and translate it to not just being on the mats, but in life. And Marcio La Selva, my instructor, he really instills that in his students. And the beauty of that entire ordeal, when we were going to go open that gym, I went and searched for any legitimate Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt in the state of Kansas. Marcy was the only dude to pop up. And called him. He said, listen, man, I've got kids. I've got a career. I'm about to turn pro and fight MMA, but I also have all these people at my gym, right? I'm willing to take the trip down 3-4 times a week if you will, if it's going to be mutual and we can both. I'll bust my ass, dude. I'll kill myself if you will just help train me and you put the same amount of effort. And he said, you know what? Before I say yes, in his Brazilian, before I say yes, McDowell, right? Because he's never said McDowell properly ever. It's always been McDowell. Before I say yes, McDowell, you have to come down and train. And so I went down there, and I went through jiu-jitsu class, I went through kickboxing class, MMA class, and then he put me through stations, right? And I was dying, and it was 45 minutes of just brutality, just getting my butt kicked, man. And all throughout, he just wanted to see if I was going to quit. And if I was going to quit, we were just going to part ways. If I didn't quit, he's willing to put the investment in. And that was it. That wrote the book.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and so we're a La Selva MMA affiliate, right? And I've been able to take all of those amazing things that he's taught me and help instill them in others. So, yeah.
And then you were telling me one time, didn't you say you wrote 2 books? Is that right?
I did, yep. Published 2 different books. They're on Amazon, Son of a Fish and Sons of Fishes. And so, one basically just talks about experiences in prison, experiences in business, the correlation between the two, and then just in life, right? Some of those things that, and there's some funny moments, right? We didn't even get into some of the just humor of just experiences that I had while in prison, but there's a number of them, but several of them are in that book, so, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, it makes me think of, I think, what's the quote? Behind every good man's a better woman. Like, I mean, you obviously give your wife a lot of credit, Jen,
Amen.
For being there behind you and sticking with you through all that stuff, those times.
Right? I mean, you think about opening the gym, right? And then the thought was, well, if I don't operate as a business, it's just going to be a club, and eventually it'll be non-existent. Those people will just quit coming. Mm-hmm. And so if you make it a business, there's other ways to help see it grow, right, and sustain itself. And so you have that type of, just, are you sure this is what you're going to do? You have that last $100 story right? Where I'm $100 meant a heck of a lot at that moment in time for us. And she didn't know, right, whether or not I was going to be successful. But here I am asking for that. And then even after I got the certification, it's always been that way in my own life. I can envision it. I can see it. And I know that if there's work that has to be done, that's the least of my worries because I'll do the work. You know what I mean? And then I just get to see the vision come to fruition. It's just always been that way, man.
How much longer do you have to go on your doctorates?
I got about a year and a half.
Oh, so you're right around the corner then.
Man, I'll start my dissertation, probably August, right? And so, yeah, that's an exciting deal. So it's been, again, going back to Jen, listen, I think I should go get a bachelor's degree in information technology. Hey, I think I should go get my master's degree, and now going with the doctorates, right? And in the midst of that, I went for several different certifications because I love project management, I love cybersecurity, and so I've dove into a lot of those different areas, and they've helped me with, especially the project management side, with just time management. I kind of took the same framework that I used in prison, right, with my time. So I would only allow myself a certain amount of time to go out and play cards and stuff like that. And even if I was playing cards or Monopoly or something like that, it was a hustle just so I could get some money, so I could afford some food, right? And so outside of that, though, I was either working out, I was reading, I was involved with college, right? Trying to get my degree, educating myself on that front. I was educating myself with anything I could learn about computers, and then taking what I was learning and teaching lifers and other inmates, right, in classes. And I would have classes throughout the course of the day that I was teaching. And so that same framework or ability to manage my time, I took that same framework when I got out, and I've used it to this day. Even today, like, my family isn't all that impacted. Not to say that they aren't, because there are some times that I just can't go out and, kick it. But throughout the week, right, they're in bed by 9:30. I don't start my work for work or the work geared towards my degree until after that. And so, when they tell you have to spend, 20 hours. Let's say you have to spend 21 hours a week on this course. Well, if I'm going from 9 to midnight, 7 times 3, I'm good, man. I'm spending 21 hours towards that class, and my family's never impacted by that investment, right? And so, as long as I know that the time I have with them is invested in them, they're good. They know Dad's doing whatever he needs to do, right, to move us forward, right? And so that philosophy throughout my career, whether it's at work or in my personal life, has really helped me stay efficient with my time. So, and at this stage, going for my doctorates, it's been fun because at this level of being a chief, you really get to understand a lot of how businesses operate. And from the technology side, it's always about how can you help align technology with the objectives of the business, right? I think we're going to see more and more organizations as they continue to adopt technology, which most of us are just down that path, right? But you truly kind of jump down the dark hole that Alice went down and to get to Wonderland. It's kind of the same thing. Like, at what point did you go so deep that you can't come back out? So if everybody hears the data-driven decisions, things like that, if the data you're using to make those driven decisions stem from software that you become dependent on to enter information into so that you can make these data-driven decisions, you're down that path of technology, and you definitely want to make sure that it aligns with the business objectives and the strategy, right? Or wherever it's going. Because if you don't position these things, you don't set the proper conditions from the front, from the beginning, it's hard to say that you can build on top of something that isn't established or doesn't work already, right? And so it's been fun, man. I'm hoping I've got some ideas on my dissertation, and it ties back to IT, strategic alignment, and business objectives and things like that. I think that a lot of those frameworks that exist today are predominantly written for for-profit sectors, and I've found myself, I think in the last 17 years, really only working with, apart from when I was consulting in between, nonprofit folks. And so they just, your for-profit is concerned with profit, growth, competitiveness, building widgets and stuff like that. Your nonprofits just don't process things the same way, right? They are concerned. Their number one is impact. And in order to make a greater impact, they need to grow, right? And in order to grow, they need to be able to sustain themselves. And so it's just a different philosophy, right? Over here for the for-profit, they may have computers sitting on a shelf. Something breaks down, they're like, just go grab one of the computers from the closet. In the nonprofit space, it's like you're MacGyver, you know what I mean? And you're trying to make things work. Yeah, so it's just a different philosophy. And a lot of times what I found, and I have done, is take a lot of those, IT frameworks and adjust them to fit the organization to make it work. But I've only seen up to this point, in studying and researching, there be one predominant nonprofit one. And even that nonprofit IT framework doesn't necessarily fit all nonprofits. And so I'm looking at, I have it built, now it's just a matter of doing the research and stuff, the case studies, and synthesizing the data, results, all that jazz. But having a pure nonprofit IT strategic framework that any nonprofit can then take and then utilize to help them align with the business and be successful, and to me, I know it, it's kind of a nerd thing, but I get excited about it. So.
No, I get excited about just business, well, in general and stuff, and just people's stories. And I thank you for coming on. Like I said, I was really, obviously, I think you're an inspiring person to me, and you've got a lot of drive, and you're doing a lot of great things, and I'm excited for you and your family, my friend.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks for having me on.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, brother.
Yep.